This meeting is being recorded.
Hola y bienvenidos a todos los oyentes de nuestra comunidad de Guamis Valley que siguen este importante espacio informativo. Mi nombre es Edwin Hernández y soy el Project Manager del proyecto administrado por Just Health Action, cuyo objetivo principal es educar a la comunidad del Duwamish Valley en todo lo relacionado al source control del Lower Duwamish Waterway. Linn, could you explain your background, please?
Hey everyone, my name is Linn Gould and I run a nonprofit called Just Health Action, and I have a grant with the Washington State Department of Ecology. It's called the Public Participation Grant, and its purpose is to increase public understanding and involvement in cleaning up contaminated sites around the state. And as part of that grant, we're hosting this podcast series. But the content was reviewed for grant consistency, but it is not necessarily endorsed by the Department of Ecology. Edwin, you're on mute.
Sorry. Mi nombre es Linn Gould y dirijo una organización sin fines de lucro llamada Just Health Action. Tengo una subvención con el Departamento de Ecología del Estado de Washington llamada Subvención de Participación Pública, con la intención de aumentar la comprensión y participación del público en la limpieza de los Superfund sites en todo el estado. Como parte de esta subvención estamos presentando esta serie de radio. Se revisó el contenido para garantizar la consistencia de la subvención, pero la agencia del Departamento de Ecología no necesariamente la respalda.
So this series is hosted by the DRCC, Duwamish River Community Coalition, and it's co-sponsored by Just Health Action through this ecology grant and the University of Washington Superfund Research Program.
Este programa es liderado por el Duwamish River Community Coalition, DRCC, con la coparticipación de Just Health Action a través del fondo del Departamento de Ecología PPG y el programa del Superfund Research de la Universidad de Washington.
So our esteemed guest today is Dr. Grant Gutierrez from the Department of Ecology. He's here to talk about the relationship between environmental justice and science. And we are going to talk about its history and generally how scientists have contributed to further environmental justice in the Duwamish Valley by collaborating with local organizations. And for some of you who, environmental justice has several definitions, but the one on Ecology's website is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. A mouthful, I agree. This goal, this environmental justice goal, will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environment and health hazards and has equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment which to live, learn, and work. We hope that this show will inspire you scientists out there to support environmental justice efforts to reduce the disproportionate impacts that occur in low-income BIPOC communities.
Nuestro invitado de hoy es el doctor Grant Gutierrez, del Departamento de Ecología. Él está aquí para hablarnos sobre la relación entre la justicia ambiental y la ciencia. Vamos a hablar de manera general sobre la historia de ambas tópicos, es decir, la justicia ambiental y la ciencia, y cómo los científicos han contribuido a una mayor justicia ambiental en el Valle del Duwamish, al colaborar con organizaciones locales. La justicia ambiental tiene varias definiciones, pero lo que se encuentra en el sitio web del Departamento de Ecología es trato justo y participación significativa de todas las personas, independientemente de su raza, de su color, de su nacionalidad de origen o de sus ingresos, con respecto al desarrollo, la implementación y al cumplimiento de las leyes, políticas y reglamentos ambientales. Este objetivo se logrará cuando todos disfruten del mismo grado de protección contra los peligros ambientales y de salud, que tengan el mismo acceso al proceso de la toma de decisiones para tener un entorno saludable en el que vivir, en el que aprender y en el que trabajar. Esperemos que este programa de radio inspire a los científicos a apoyar los esfuerzos de justicia ambiental para reducir los impactos desproporcionados en las comunidades BIPOC y en las comunidades de bajos ingresos. Bienvenido, Grant.
Well, we're so glad to have you here, Grant. So ready for question number one? It's an easy one.
Great.
Grant, can you tell us a little bit about who you are? Like, what is your background and what is your role at Department of Ecology?
Yes, of course. Good morning, everyone. Buenos
Sorry,
días.
sorry, Grant, I translate the
Yeah.
question in Spanish. Muchas gracias, Grant, por tenerte aquí. ¿Podrías contarnos un poco sobre ti y cuál es tu experiencia y cuál es tu rol dentro del Departamento de Ecología?
Sí, por supuesto. Gracias por invitarme. I'm very glad to be here. Buenos días. Me llamo Grant Gutierrez. My name is Grant Gutierrez, and right now I work as the Environmental Justice Planner for the Hazardous Waste and Toxics Reduction Program at the Department of Ecology. So for those that aren't familiar, sometimes a big agency like the Department of Ecology can be a little hard to figure out from the outside, but it's structured with different programs like air quality or water quality or shorelines, or my program, which is the Hazardous Waste Program. So in my role, I'm the expert on environmental justice issues important to our program's jurisdiction. Like, for example, reducing the disproportionate impacts on communities of color from the disposal of dangerous waste and toxic waste. My position is actually a newly created position, and it's the first of its kind in the agency. So it's the first position to be housed in a program that specifically focuses on environmental justice. So there's a lot of room to experiment and shape the role, which is a really exciting opportunity. And I'm really excited to join the agency in this capacity. Before starting at ecology, I finished my PhD in anthropology and ecology at Dartmouth College. And during my PhD research, I was collaborating for part of it with DRCC on a community-based research project around the politics of environmental justice in the Duwamish Valley and the Superfund cleanup process. And before that, before doing a PhD, I was working as a community organizer in New York and Seattle and California. And so while I work for the state now, I do come from a background and have an understanding of what it means to work with and collaborate with community to advance environmental justice and to promote equity, inclusion, and most importantly, respect for the many different communities of the public that ecology serves.
Muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Grant Gutierrez y actualmente trabajo como planificador de justicia ambiental para el programa de reducción de desechos tóxicos y peligrosos en el Departamento de Ecología. El Departamento de Ecología se estructura con diferentes programas, como el programa de calidad de aire o programa de calidad de agua, o como mi programa, que es el de residuos peligrosos. Soy un experto en temas de justicia ambiental, lo cual es un tema muy importante en nuestro programa. Por ejemplo, cómo reducir los desechos peligrosos y tóxicos. En realidad, mi puesto es un nuevo puesto recientemente creado y el primero de su tipo en el Departamento de Ecología, por lo que hay mucho espacio para experimentar y dar forma a este nuevo rol, que lo hace emocionante. Antes de empezar en el Departamento de Ecología, estaba terminando un PhD, un doctorado en Antropología y Ecología. Durante mis estudios de investigación del doctorado, colaboré con el DRCC en la investigación comunitaria sobre la política de justicia ambiental en el Valle del Duwamish y el proceso de limpieza del Superfund site. Y antes de eso, trabajé como organización comunitaria en Nueva York y Seattle. Entonces, aunque ahora trabajo para el Estado, tengo experiencia de trabajar y colaborar con la comunidad para promover la justicia ambiental y hacer esto que las estructuras se puedan rendir cuentas.
So, Grant, today we want to talk about the relationship between environmental justice and science. Can you talk a little bit about the history of environmental justice and science and how it came together?
Hoy hablaremos sobre la relación entre la justicia ambiental y la ciencia. Grant, ¿nos podrías hablar brevemente sobre la historia de ambos tópicos?
Yeah, of course. Actually, it's really interesting and I think important for all of us to keep in mind that the history of environmental justice is really central to how scientists who work in the public sphere operate today. And, you know, as many people probably know, environmental justice really emerged as a political and social movement out of early civil rights, feminist, Red Power, indigenous political movements in the 1960s and 1970s. So it emerged in the United States during a time of explosive social movement reconfiguration of the landscape of politics and civil rights in the United States. And in particular, in the 1980s, as the civil rights movement really grew and became codified into law, there were Black communities in Warren County, North Carolina, were starting to understand that their communities were becoming targets for the dumping and siting of dangerous waste in hazardous waste facilities and for building disposal facilities in their communities. So these activists in North Carolina really began to dig into this issue, right? This issue of the fact that they were seeing more and more increasing numbers of hazardous waste facilities being built in their neighborhoods and in their communities. And so they partnered with the United Church of Christ in 1987 to develop a report called Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. And that showed how hazardous waste facilities in the country were being disproportionately cited in communities of color. So what that means is that there were more hazardous waste facilities in Black and brown communities than there were in white communities. And this pattern that they demonstrated through data, they termed this pattern environmental racism. And so once these activists established this pattern of environmental racism, it really became essential and central to that argument to establish and demonstrate the effects that this pattern had, that this unequal distribution of hazardous waste facilities had on Black communities in North Carolina. And so that became a problem for the scientific and environmental justice community to address, to really understand through the collection of data, identifying correlations with that data, and amplifying the stories from community members, really to use science to understand the impacts of toxic waste on the health of Black communities. And so, you know, one thing that's really similar in North Carolina is that same structural system that they identified, environmental racism, you know, that system, environmental racism, has really contributed to the kinds of experience of pollution that we see in the Duwamish Valley and that organizations are working to address today. But once this early wave of activists and scientists started to identify, pollution and environmental racism and the effects of pollution, environmental justice activists continue to be really strategic in developing alliances and partnerships with scientists to amplify and bolster their cause. So, for example, we can take early public health epidemiologists and toxicologists. And these kinds of scientists are scientists who study the effects of pollution on people's health and the environment. So early environmental justice activists partnered with these scientists to understand how that pollution was impacting them, like I said. And the community would have data to prove to government agencies, federal, state, and even local health jurisdictions that there were injustices related to environmental health disparities, that there really were provable inequities in environmental politics. And so these kind of alliances grew and took new forms, and different environmental justice problems were defined and evolved over time. And so today it's very common for scientists of all backgrounds and engineers of all backgrounds to collaborate with environmental justice experts, for example, as demonstrated by my new position at the Department of Ecology. Does that give a nice overview? I think that should give a nice starting place.
Thank you. Ok, en realidad la historia de la justicia ambiental es realmente fundamental para la forma en que los científicos que trabajan en la esfera pública operan hoy. Incluso si no se dan cuenta, como muchas personas probablemente saben, la justicia ambiental surgió de los movimientos políticos indígenas, feministas y de derechos civiles en los años 60 y 70. En particular, en la década de los 80, las comunidades negras del condado de Warren, en Carolina del Norte, se dieron cuenta que sus comunidades se estaban convirtiendo en el objetivo de verter desechos peligrosos y construir sus instalaciones de eliminación de desechos peligrosos. Entonces, los activistas en Carolina del Norte comenzaron a profundizar el tema y en 1987, con la ayuda de la Iglesia Unida de Cristo, desarrollaron un informe que mostraba que las instalaciones de desechos peligrosos en el país estaban ubicadas de manera desproporcionada en comunidades de color. A este patrón lo denominaron racismo ambiental. Entonces, una vez que los activistas establecieron el patrón de racismo ambiental, se volvió esencial demostrar los efectos que esta distribución de instalaciones de desechos peligrosos tenía en esas comunidades. Esto se convirtió en un problema que la comunidad científica y de justicia ambiental podría abordar mediante la recopilación de datos, la identificación de correlaciones y la amplificación de las historias de los miembros de la comunidad. De manera similar a lo sucedido en Carolina del Norte, es en este mismo sistema estructural y de racismo ambiental lo que ha contribuido a cómo las comunidades experimentan la contaminación en el Duwamish Valley. Los activistas por la justicia ambiental continúan siendo realmente estratégicos en la creación de alianzas con los científicos, de modo de ayudarlos a reforzar su causa por la lucha. Por ejemplo, tomemos a los primeros epidemiólogos y toxicólogos de salud pública. Estos son científicos que estudian los efectos de la contaminación en la salud de las personas y el medio ambiente. Los primeros activistas por la justicia ambiental se asociaron con estos científicos para comprender cómo la contaminación tóxica estaba afectando a la comunidad, de modo que la comunidad tuviera datos para demostrar a las agencias gubernamentales que había injusticias relacionadas con las disparidades en la salud ambiental. Este tipo de alianzas creció y tomó nuevas formas a medida que se definían diferentes problemas de justicia ambiental. Hoy en día es común que científicos e ingenieros de todos los orígenes colaboren con expertos en justicia ambiental, como lo demuestra mi nuevo cargo en el Departamento de Ecología.
That's great. Edwin, I really appreciate you doing such a comprehensive translation and interpretation of my responses, but feel free to also paraphrase as well too, if that helps. And you know, if you don't need to try to track everything I'm saying so quickly, you can just use the short answers. But Edwin, something that I think is really cool that I'd like to talk with you about is that we see these strategic alliances and these collaborations with scientists and environmental justice communities at play in the Duwamish Valley. For example, Edwin, I know that you're an engineer by training, which is its own kind of science. So I'm wondering if you could talk with me about your experience working in the Duwamish Valley as an engineer on environmental justice issues.
Ok, la pregunta que Grant me hace es, hoy en día es genial ver el trabajo del Valle de Duwamish. Están relacionadas estratégicas y colaborativas entre los científicos y las comunidades de justicia ambiental. Por ejemplo, Edwin, sé que eres ingeniero de formación, que es su propio tipo de ciencia. Me pregunto si podría hablar sobre su experiencia en ingeniería y cómo ha funcionado la ciencia con la justicia ambiental en su trabajo en el Valle del Duwamish. Okay. Bueno, mi respuesta es, ¿no?, que actualmente varias organizaciones públicas como la EPA, el Puerto de Seattle, el Departamento de Ecología, etcétera, vienen desarrollando en la comunidad de South Park diversos trabajos de restauración ambiental. También existen organizaciones comunitarias como el DRCC, Just Health Action, etcétera, que también involucran a científicos independientes quienes les ayudan a revisar informes, documentos, leyes, etcétera, elaborados por organizaciones públicas, convirtiéndose en nuestros consultores comunitarios en temas relacionados con la justicia ambiental. Debido a su trabajo de los científicos, ellos utilizan muchos términos técnicos, lo que a menudo dificulta su explicación con la comunidad. Dadas mis propias habilidades como mi profesión y mi experiencia en ingeniería, me permite hablar con los científicos de manera más fácil y directa, captar los conceptos para luego, utilizando un lenguaje sencillo, ayudar a la comunidad preparando materiales de divulgación comunitaria. También sabemos que estos trabajos de restauración ambiental en el Valle del Duwamish Valley llevarán muchos años. Y es por eso que tomé la iniciativa de trabajar con jóvenes y en conjunto desarrollar proyectos de desarrollo sostenibles para nuestra comunidad bajo un enfoque de justicia ambiental. Todo esto con el fin de despertar en ellos una motivación en profesiones relacionadas al STEAM, es decir, ciencia, tecnología, ingeniería y matemáticas, para que en un futuro próximo sean ellos los que se conviertan en los futuros científicos y puedan continuar con esta gran labor que vienen realizando los actuales científicos bajo un enfoque de justicia ambiental.
Great. So I'm going to take a chance at translating what you said for our English speaking audience, just for their benefit as well. So, I'm not an interpreter and I'm speaking for Edwin, but what I heard Edwin saying is that, he was talking about this really complicated landscape of different agencies like the EPA, the port, my agency, the Department of Ecology, developing these different kinds, different levels of environmental restoration works that are happening in the Duwamish Valley. And when that happens, there's a lot of really technical information that's happening, right? Science is very technical. The language of science and environmental restoration is not very accessible for the broader community that are not trained as experts in those fields to understand. So Edwin, as someone that takes these issues very seriously and understands them deeply as an engineer, has been working with organizations like DVSA, which is Duwamish Valley Sustainability Association, or Just Health Action, or DRCC, which are community-led organizations, to really help translate these technical terms that are used in these scientific processes and make them accessible for the public. So really to promote equity in how community can understand with and engage with these complex scientific processes. A lot of what he does has been to engage youth and youth education in these processes as well, to make sure that they can understand the issues from a scientific perspective so that they connect the dots where environmental justice and science touch in the issues that affect them in the Duwamish Valley.
It's so cool. And I think it's one of the reasons why Edwin and I work together so well, because unfortunately, I have two masters. One is a master's in soil science and the other one's in master's in public health. And I've been working with, how do you translate this technical, very, very difficult information into the community? And I've been honored to work with Edwin because he translates a lot of that into Spanish. But Grant, could you give some examples of how scientists have contributed to environmental justice in the Duwamish Valley?
Yeah, and I think we can think of this contribution in broad brushstrokes. So not just scientists at the Department of Ecology, but I can think of a lot of ways that scientists in general have been really important to how environmental justice activists and environmental justice community organizations have really been able to promote equity in their communities. So, as a lot of us know, the history of how the Superfund was listed, the Superfund is listed through an EPA program, but before that, that was listed in 2001. In the 1980s and 1990s, Duwamish Valley community members and activists like B.J. Cummings, who we all know, James Rasmussen, John Beal, these community activists really worked with scientists and compliance inspectors from the Department of Ecology to understand the sources of pollution that were occurring in the Duwamish Valley. And that's work that still continues to this day, right? We know the historic sources of pollution, and we're still trying to understand ongoing pollution to the river. But once they realized how big the problem of pollution was, these community members and these scientists really advocated for the river to be listed under the EPA Superfund program. And this was really a major step in promoting environmental justice for Duwamish Valley communities, because it created this coordinated, comprehensive effort between the federal government and different responsible parties, as I'm sure, a lot of people that are listening to this radio show are familiar with. So that's one kind of early and important collaboration between environmental justice and scientists that I see happening in the Duwamish Valley. The other one, Lynn, is, something that I really admire about your work and I think has been really important, is, how you, through Just Health Action, contributed to and developed the cumulative health impact analysis, or what people know as the CHIA. And, you know, my understanding is that this work drew on the work that's been done by public health epidemiology to demonstrate the kind of unfortunately large health disparities for people who live in the Duwamish Valley. So this hybrid use of science and public health and community activism really helped to contribute to and create broad policy shifts, both within Seattle and King County more broadly, and at the state level. So Ecology made the decision to fund multiple studies in the Lower Duwamish Waterway source control area. And my understanding is through the funding of these studies also assigned permanent kind of scientific, engineering, and community outreach staff to assist Duwamish Valley communities in understanding pollution and its sources. Through that creation of the CHIA, I also believe that you know, Washington State used similar methodology from EPA's tools or California's Environmental Protection Agency, which is called Cal EPA, and Washington State developed something very similar to the CHIA, the Washington State level, which we call the Washington Health Disparities Map. And the Washington Health Disparities Map, along with EPA's EJ screen, are really important tools that we use to identify environmental justice issues that matter to the public of Washington State. Another example I can think of that I know DRCC.
Grant, yeah, I'm going to interrupt you just a bit and maybe have Edwin do before you go on to any more examples. Yeah. Let's have Edwin give a couple, like do some translation.
Sounds great.
Okay, la pregunta de Linn a Gran es, Gran, ¿puede pensar 4 o 5 instancias en que los científicos han colaborado con las comunidades del Duwamish Valley? La respuesta de Gran es por ejemplo, ¿no? Tenemos a B.J. Cummings, James Rasmussen y John Bell, entre otros científicos, personas de la comunidad necesitaron asociarse con científicos para abogar por la inclusión en el río Duwamish en un sitio de Superfund Site para que pudiera limpiarse y con ello la comunidad pudiera beneficiarse en su futuro. Otro ejemplo de justicia ambiental es el análisis de impacto acumulativo en la salud que fue realizado por Linn Gould a través de Just Health Action. Este documento utilizó un enfoque híbrido de ciencia e investigación aplicada y esto generó los cambios en las políticas para las comunidades del Duwamish Valley. Ese es un poco resumen de lo que habló Grant. Grant, ¿puedes continuar, por favor?
Perfecto. Gracias, Edwin. So, yeah, Edwin mentioned, you know, and we were just talking about kind of early listing of Superfund and then the creating of this CHIA, this cumulative health impact analysis, which is really important. And I think there are 2 other examples that I can think about that are really related to work in the Duwamish Valley. So one is the work that is happening right now with the United States Forest Service, which is part of the Department of Agriculture, and Duwamish Valley Youth. And so this issue in particular is the Moss Project. And so for those that aren't familiar, Forest Service scientists have partnered with DVYC, Duwamish Valley Youth Corps, and the Duwamish Valley communities to use moss as a bioindicator. So what we mean by the word bioindicator is that the moss can be collected by these youth scientists to actually tell us a lot about the environment in the area. So these federal scientists partner with community organizations and train youth in scientific methods and become youth scientists to develop a research plan to collect this moss and then analyze and sample that moss to tell us a lot about things like air quality and air pollution. And that really helps guide researchers and policymakers in the work that they do. And I'll just give one last example before I let you help me translate. The last example that I can think about that is related to environmental justice and community health is the relationship between the fisher community and fish consumption and environmental pollution in the river. So it's really important that there is solid evidence and data to protect fishers who use the river for subsistence and cultural purposes. So scientific data from the Department of Ecology and other agencies really helped to inform the Washington State Department of Health, a different agency, creating these seafood advisories for the lower Duwamish waterway. And the seafood advisory really describes which seafood should be avoided and which fish can be eaten, but limited to certain quantities, and what those quantities are, and really help to create signs and information about which fish you can eat, which fish you can't, to make that clear, translated into languages that matter and are relevant to the communities that live in the Duwamish Valley. And, not only that has this been used at the state level, but EPA also uses this information to inform its seafood consumption as part of the institutional controls of the Superfund site. And then I'm sure you guys all have talked about different forms of controls. And so as part of that work, community health advocates, or the CHAs, who are members of the Duwamish Valley or the local community or the local seafood consuming communities, they share their information and their experience and also receive feedback. So there's this dynamic collaborative relationship, which helps to bring Seattle, King County Public Health and EPA together to collaborate around important environmental justice and science issues in the Duwamish Valley. So these community health advocates provide feedback to help agencies improve their messaging, and so that the community itself can make safe decisions about the seafood that they catch, what they eat, and how they're exposed to contaminants, and hopefully reduce those exposure to contaminants.
Ok. Otro ejemplo de lo que se habla de justicia ambiental y la ciencia es el proyecto de musgo que se viene realizando en el Duwamish Valley, donde participan científicos con organizaciones comunitarias, en este caso el Duwamish Valley Youth Corps, e involucran a la comunidad a través de los jóvenes para crear proyectos de ciencia juvenil donde recolectan los musgos que son bioindicadores, y a la vez comprendan cómo se produce y genera la contaminación del aire en el Duwamish Valley. Otro ejemplo de justicia ambiental y de ciencia en el Duwamish Valley es el trabajo que vienen realizando los toxicólogos y los ecologistas, que han sido fundamentales en el desarrollo de avisos sobre los temas de pescados y mariscos contaminados que hay en el Lower Duwamish Waterway. Esta unión entre los científicos y la comunidad ha permitido que la comunidad sepa sobre los problemas y a través de ellos puedan producir carteles o anuncios que se colocan en zonas estratégicas donde la comunidad de pescadores van, y con ello ellos se pueden informar sobre los problemas a su salud, qué es lo que pueden comer, qué es lo que no pueden comer, con qué frecuencia. Y en este tema se están involucrados la EPA, el Public Health, Seattle King County y otras organizaciones de salud pública.
Eso.
So one thing that Grant maybe he didn't know, is that Edwin was a community health advocate for 2 or 3 years. So
wow, I did not know that. No sabía.
Yeah. So Just Health Action got 3 years of grants from the Duwamish River Opportunity Fund to work with the Vietnamese community and the Spanish-speaking community to do the CHA work. So Edwin was one of those people that reached out to communities. And it was, and from an environmental justice perspective, it was important because it's about meaningful involvement. Edwin was meaningfully moving out, asking, engaging the community to ask what kind of things that they needed to eat fish more safely.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pause there, Lynn. I think that's a really important example of what meaningful involvement looks like. And I think it's something that we at the agency are really working to figure out what that means for us. And I think that's a really good example of how to involve someone from the community and have them use their lived experience and their local expertise to really help guide these processes. I think that's a really good example that we can look at and learn from in government about what meaningful involvement looks like.
Okay, so my next question, Grant, is about the HEAL Act. There's been, I think people have sort of heard that there's some type of environmental justice act called the HEAL Act, but to be honest, I don't think a lot of people really understand like how it works and what kind of impact it has. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that from your perspective.
Ok, la siguiente pregunta es, hay una palabra HEAL que se está escuchando mucho ahorita actualmente y hay un impacto del que estamos hablando hoy día, pero muchos de nuestra comunidad no entienden qué significa esto. Si eso es así, ¿cómo? ¿Qué significa esto y cómo se consigue, Gran?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up the HEAL Act, Linn, especially on the tail of that, conversation we just had about meaningful community involvement. So it's a really exciting time to do environmental justice law and policy in the country, but especially in Washington State. We've been engaged in environmental justice work in Washington State for a while now, but this new law, the Healthy Environment for All Act, or the HEAL Act, is the state's new environmental justice law. And it's really an innovative law. And it does create new momentum and kind of a renaissance or a new kind of movement of what environmental justice looks like in state government. So kind of the broad brushstrokes of what this law does is that it creates obligations and mandates for 7 state agencies with the ability for other agencies to opt in if they'd like, but there are directly covered agencies in that law, one of which is the Department of Ecology, to really advance environmental justice. And so it asks us to do that in kind of several different ways. One of them is that it asks us to create processes for conducting environmental justice analyses into what is called significant agency actions, or actions that are important to the agency. And, there are some very specific categories for that. And there's also the ability for each agency to define what they consider a significant agency action. And those environmental justice analyses will really become instrumental in us understanding this broad and diverse landscape of environmental justice and inequity in state government and in the processes that we engage in. The other thing that it asks us to do is to create a community engagement plan. Specifically kind of an environmental justice and equity community engagement plan, which will help provide consistency across states' government and to expand processes and create clear guidance for how community can participate in government actions. So this new engagement plan, we're really actually right now in the midst of creating it, is intended to allow us to formalize many of the environmental justice processes that we've been developing over the last decade or so, and to modernize public participation in state government. And so one thing that's important to know about the HEAL Act is the law just passed in 2021. And so we are really at the beginning of implementing this law, and it's a process that's going to unfold over the next few years or so. One thing that I will say about where we're at with this community engagement plan is that we just created a provisional plan that has been developed in collaboration with a team of government employees from all of the agencies that are covered by this law. And this community engagement plan, the spirit of it is to really work to center and collaborate with community to produce meaningful community involvement. So we are, working with the state's EJ Council that was developed through this HEAL Act, with other state agencies to solicit feedback from the EJ Council, from the public in Washington, to really make sure that this is a plan that works. And another thing that is really helpful, that's separate from the HEAL Act, but is a new law that was passed by the legislature very recently called State Senate Bill 5793, is a piece of legislation to help the state pay and compensate community members for their labor and their expertise when they provide guidance in very particular matters to give insight and their experience about state decision-making processes. So we're at the very beginning stages of figuring all of that out, but there's a lot that is coming down.
This meeting is being recorded.
I don't think a lot of people really understand like how it works
pay and compensate community members for their labor and their expertise when they provide guidance in very particular matters to give insight and their experience about state decision-making processes. So we're at the very beginning stages of figuring all of that out, but there's a lot that is coming down and that we're trying to work to implement.
Ok, estoy muy contento que hayas mencionado la ley Hale. Es un momento realmente emocionante para la justicia ambiental en la legislación y en la política del país, y especialmente en el estado de Washington. Para aquellos que no saben, la ley de medio ambiente saludable para todos, o lo que llamamos la ley Hale, es la ley de justicia ambiental del estado de Washington. Esta ley crea obligaciones y mandatos para 7 agencias estatales para promover la justicia ambiental. Por ejemplo, crea procesos para realizar análisis de justicia ambiental para acciones importantes del Departamento de Ecología. También solicita que las agencias estatales creen un plan de participación comunitaria que ayudará a brindar coherencia en todo el gobierno estatal y expandir los procesos y una guía clara sobre cómo las comunidades pueden participar en las acciones gubernamentales. El nuevo plan de participación tiene como objetivo permitirnos formalizar muchos de los procesos de justicia ambiental que hemos estado incorporando, aumentar el acceso público a la información y modernizar la participación pública para ayudar a satisfacer las necesidades de la comunidad. Actualmente, Ecología como agencia está en el proceso de crear un nuevo plan de participación comunitaria que la ley Hale nos obliga a crear. Estamos haciendo esto en colaboración con un equipo de empleados gubernamentales de todas las agencias estatales para coordinar nuestro enfoque y producir una dirección unificada. El nuevo plan de participación comunitaria realmente funcionará para centrar y colaborar con la comunidad. Washington también aprobó recientemente una legislación para ayudar al Estado a pagar el trabajo y la experiencia de los miembros de la comunidad que brindan orientación sobre los procesos estatales. Estamos buscando formas de usar esta autoridad en nuestros procesos de participación comunitaria, ya que sabemos que compensar a las personas por su tiempo y garantizar la participación en nuestra participación es fundamental para promover la justicia ambiental.
Perfecto, gracias a Edwin.
Well, thank you. That's your perspectives are so interesting, Grant. We've never worked with an anthropologist before at DRCC, so this is super fun. We're now at closing at the end of our show, and we're just wondering if you had what 3 takeaways the public to know when they leave today.
Muchas gracias, Grant, por tu explicación. Y ya estamos en la parte final del programa y quisiéramos que nos comentes cuáles son las 3 conclusiones del programa de hoy que deseas que nuestra comunidad lo recuerden siempre.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I wrote these down so that we remember what they are. So one is that the history of environmental justice, like we talked about at the beginning, that history of environmental justice has always been one of strategic alliances between scientists, engineers, and policymakers and community activists, and that they have taken these cues from community organizers to understand important problems that affect the public. And that has been the history of environmental justice, these deep collaborations between scientists, engineers, and activists. The second is that I think it's really important for community members to understand and remember that science can be used as an important tool to help bolster their claims and what they know, so that community experience and community knowledge is a first place to identify problems, and that science can really help to advance that. And that science is only one piece, but it really takes that community knowledge. And then the third thing is where we ended, which is that the HEAL Act is really an exciting new environmental justice law that creates a lot of new obligations for state agencies like my agency, the Department of Ecology, to improve our community involvement in decision-making processes. Duwamish Valley communities should really be aware of this new law and explore the ways that they can participate in shaping better environmental health outcomes for their communities. So those would be the 3 takeaways.
Ok, el primer punto importante que desea compartir es que la historia de la justicia ambiental ha sido una de las alianzas estratégicas con científicos, ingenieros y legisladores, y que han seguido el ejemplo de las organizaciones comunitarias para comprender los problemas importantes que afectan al público, a las comunidades. Como segundo punto es que es realmente importante que los miembros de la comunidad recuerden y entiendan que la ciencia puede usarse como una herramienta importante para ayudar a reforzar sus afirmaciones, y que también la ciencia es solo una pieza que realmente necesita la comunidad. Y finalmente, la ley HEAL es una nueva y emocionante ley de justicia ambiental que crea muchas obligaciones nuevas para las agencias estatales, como ecología, para mejorar la participación de la comunidad en la toma de decisiones. Las comunidades del Duwamish Valley deben estar al tanto de esta nueva ley y explorar formas de participar para dar forma a mejores resultados en temas ambientales y de salud.
Bueno.
Yay, thank you. So in closing, today is our last podcast sponsored under this Ecology Public Participation Grant. We are thankful to all of our wonderful guests over the past few months, including from the Department of Ecology, Kelsey Ketchinson, Jessica Heibrecht, Priscilla Tomlinson, and of course you, Grant. And then from King County, we had Deborah Williston. From Public Utilities, we had Nate Hart. And then there were many other wonderful guests from the EPA, University of Washington, Washington State Department of Health, and Seattle Public Utilities, who were interviewed by DRCC. The community really learned a lot from this experience. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Ok, bueno, hoy día es nuestro último programa radial relacionado al Source Control, patrocinado bajo la subvención de participación pública del Departamento de Ecología. Agradecemos a todos nuestros invitados, nuestros maravillosos invitados durante estos meses, y queremos mencionar especialmente al Departamento de Ecología, que Kelsey Ketchison, Jessica Hubrecht, Priscilla Tomlinson y Grant Gutierrez, que nos acompaña el día de hoy. Del condado de King County estuvo con nosotros Deborah Williston, y del Departamento de Servicios Públicos de la ciudad de Seattle nos acompañó Nate Hart. También hubieron muchos invitados, maravillosos invitados de la EPA, de la Universidad de Washington, el Departamento de Salud del Estado de Washington y de los Servicios Públicos de Seattle, que fueron entrevistados directamente por el Duwamish River Community Coalition, o el DRCC. Y bueno, y queremos agradecerle a todos porque nuestra comunidad aprendieron un poco más a través de estas sesiones de radio.
Sí,
Gracias
muchísimas gracias por invitarme. Ha sido un placer enorme de estar con ustedes aquí esta mañana. It's been such a great pleasure, and I hope that we learned a little bit more about science and environmental justice. Y yo espero que aprendimos más sobre la justicia ambiental y la ciencia. And yeah, it was just such a treat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Grant.
Muchas gracias, Grant. Hasta la próxima, amigos del Duwamish Valley.